I grew up in a small town where everyone knew each other's business. My dad ran the local hardware store, and my mom kept our home warm and welcoming. I had an older sister who, despite occasional sibling rivalry, always looked out for me. Life was simple, filled with helping at the store or playing sports with friends. My parents emphasized hard work and honesty, and my life was mostly straightforward. Things changed during my teenage years when I attended a prestigious all-boys private school, thanks to my parents' belief in education. It was there that I first encountered social class differences. The wealthy kids often reminded me of my lower middle-class background, leading to frequent verbal and physical fights. Despite the odds, I managed to hold my own. During this time, I met Greg Sands, a boxer who would become my best friend and change my life. Why do people do what they do? It's a question I often ponder, especially regarding those I love. My wife is unfaithful, though she thinks I'm unaware. The truth is, I've known for a while. My upbringing was normal, loving parents and an older sister. My parents valued education, so I ended up at a strict all-boys private school that prioritized football, religion, and academics. Being middle class among wealthy students was tough, and I never fit in. Snobby rich kids targeted me, and I frequently got into fights. To channel my frustrations, I joined a boxing class at the Police Boys Club. This decision changed my life. I met kids like me and, more importantly, Greg Sands. Greg, a talented boxer and the son of a cop, quickly became my best friend. After an initial knockout in the ring, we became inseparable. Greg also attended my school, thanks to his dad's connections, and together, we handled the bullies. One day, a bully insulted my family and I snapped, breaking his nose and knocking out some teeth. Greg, always loyal, had my back and took care of the other bullies. While Greg was kind to his friends, he was ruthless to his enemies. We quickly dealt with a few more reinforcements and thought nothing of it. They had done this to me before, and I usually tried to plot revenge, though it rarely worked. However, making rich enemies was a mistake. Douglas's father, a powerful businessman, was furious. He got Sandman and me suspended for the rest of the year, even though only a month of classes remained. He also had us charged with attack. Luckily, witnesses from the girls' school backed our story, confirming that Douglas started it. Sandman's dad, the deputy chief, also helped. While the attack charges were dropped, the suspension stuck, and Douglas's father even tried to make my parents pay for his son's surgery. I spent the summer working at my dad's hardware store, staying out of trouble. Sandman and I hung out, hit the gym, and ran together. He even tried to hit on my older sister, but she was headed to college and wasn't interested. Life stayed pretty much the same throughout school. Douglas Peterson vowed revenge, but I knew it wouldn't be physical since he'd met his match. Sandman became the heavyweight state champ, and I did well too, placing in the top 10. Sandman thought about turning pro, but didn't want to end up like his bitter uncle, who was broken from boxing. In our final year, we started dating girls from the neighboring school, and with our cars, we spent a lot of time cruising around. I lost my pureness to Susan Bates, but it wasn't love, just good times. Meanwhile, Douglas never forgave me for humiliating him. He had everything: money, looks, power, but he was only happy when hurting someone. He sought revenge by dating Susan, thinking I loved her, but I wasn't too bothered. Sandman and I eventually decided the Army was the best option since my family couldn't afford college. We enlisted together, missing prom due to basic training, which didn't bother us. I quickly realized the Army wasn't for me beyond my initial commitment, but Sandman thrived in uniform and aimed for special forces. After basic training, I returned home before starting officer training. Sandman teased me, but I knew I could handle it and eventually earn a business degree. This marked the first time in years we'd be apart, and I didn't realize it would be many years before I saw him again. Officer training went smoothly, and I graduated as Second Lieutenant Roger Easton. The business degree required more Army time, extending my commitment by 3 years. I was assigned to the Army History Unit, which meant office work, but I enjoyed learning about Army traditions and history, thanks to a great sergeant. I hadn't heard from Sandman in a while as he was deployed in dangerous areas. I worried, but knew he was well trained. Meanwhile, I found stability in my routine, studying for my degree and boxing when I could. The only thing missing was a good woman. Though I dated and had flings, I hadn't found someone I connected with, until everything changed. I returned to my hometown for a music festival weekend, planning to visit my parents, Sandman's folks, and catch up with friends over some beers. On Friday night, I got the latest updates. My dad was thinking about selling the hardware store and retiring, and Sandman's dad had become the police chief. though they hadn't heard from Sandman due to the secretive nature of his work. Saturday morning, after my run and breakfast, I helped my dad open the store. That's when I ran into Susan Bates, now Susan Peterson, who was in town for the festival with her cousin, Kelly. Susan mentioned Doug was overseas on business, and she introduced me to Kelly, who was stunning. We agreed to meet up at the festival later. My dad teased me about Susan being on the prowl despite her marriage, but I only had eyes for Kelly. After catching up with friends, I headed to the festival, where I found Susan, drunk and flirting with everyone, while Kelly looked uncomfortable. I joined them, bought drinks and food, and endured Susan's endless chatter about her life. She married Doug right after graduation, but it was likely a rifle wedding due to a pregnancy that ended in a mishap. Doug now managed international business for his father's company. Eventually, Susan left with Peter Morrison to check out his car, and Kelly, relieved, joked about her cousin's departure. We spent the rest of the evening getting to know each other, finding we had much in common. Kelly worked as a human resources manager at Peterson Corporation thanks to Susan's help. We ended the night exchanging numbers and planned a date for the following week. Things moved quickly between us, and after nearly 2 years of dating, we were very close. Kelly was traditional and wanted to wait until marriage for Zex, which was frustrating but allowed us to grow closer emotionally. Despite the occasional presence of Susan and the lingering shadow of Doug, we made it work. Kelly's parents, though wealthier, accepted me, especially since her father, a retired general, and I found common ground through the military. After completing my degree, I proposed to Kelly, and she accepted. Her father gave his blessing, though her mother, less thrilled, insisted on a prenuptial agreement, likely influenced by Doug. The wedding went smoothly, though Sandman couldn't attend. His younger brother stepped in as my best man, and thankfully, Doug was overseas. It was a wonderful day, and even better, Kelly and I discovered we were just as compatible in bed as out. Life moved on as expected. We bought a nice house in a good neighborhood and started planning for the future. We both wanted kids, but first I had to decide between staying in the Army or switching to civilian life. We agreed I should use my degree, so I began looking for a new career. I got lucky and landed a job at a major bank overseeing internal and external security. The pay was double what I made in the Army, so I left the military. We immediately started trying for kids, but nothing happened. After a doctor's visit, I found out I was sterile. I planned to break the news to Kelly during a surprise cruise, but things changed when she announced she'd been promoted and would be traveling with Doug Peterson, now her boss, on a business trip. I had a bad feeling, but couldn't say much. Kelly assured me Doug had changed and was all business. The morning she left, Doug arrived in a limo with a grin, and they drove off. I spent the next few days sulking. Kelly called, saying everything was fine. Then, on Saturday morning, there was a knock at the door. It was Sandman. He looked tougher and more world-weary, but that's what war does. We hugged, grabbed beers, and caught up. Sandman had left the Army after 10 years, tired of the liquidating. I updated him on my life, including the connection to Doug, and we laughed about Susan marrying him. As we talked, Sandman recognized General Bates, Kelly's father, from my wedding photos. He revealed that General Bates had been his commander in Special Forces and hinted at Mrs. Bates's affairs with officers, explaining that this led to the general's retirement to avoid scandal. This revelation left me questioning the family I had married into. I invited Sandman to stay the night, but he had to leave. Before going, he mentioned he was starting police academy training on Monday. He promised to visit again when Kelly returned. As I mulled over everything, I couldn't help but worry about Doug and Kelly, especially given the new information about her family. The next week flew by with work keeping me busy. Kelly called a few times, and by Friday night, she was home. She seemed like her usual self, and we spent the night reconnecting. The next day, I told Kelly about Sandman's return and arranged for them to meet. When Sandman arrived with flowers and wine, I was about to introduce him to Kelly when suddenly, "Oh my God, Greg, you're Sandman," Kelly exclaimed. "Hi, Kelly. Good to see you," Sandman replied. I was shocked. Turns out Kelly knew Sandman from the Army base when her dad was in charge. They caught up for hours, and I felt like a third wheel. While cooking dinner, I overheard something like, "Does he know?" When I asked what they meant, they both looked awkward. Sandman left, saying Kelly and I needed to talk. Kelly explained that she and Sandman had dated on the base, with her dad's approval, but broke up when Sandman went to Iraq. She assured me it was all in the past. But I realized Sandman still had feelings for her, which explained why he avoided our wedding. I asked Kelly if this would be a problem, and she said no, that she loved only me. Still, I was upset neither of them had mentioned it earlier. When I called Sandman, he apologized, saying he didn't want to stir up old issues. I accepted his explanation. Life continued, with Kelly busier than ever in her new job, and kids took a back seat, so I didn't bring up my sterility. Sandman became a cop and joined the pill squad. But at home, things started to change. Our Zek's life dwindled as Kelly worked late and traveled with Doug more often. I began to suspect something was wrong. Needing time to think, I decided to help my dad close his store as he retired. Kelly supported the idea, saying she'd be busy with work all week anyway. At the store, Dad surprised me by suggesting I protect myself, hinting at rumors that Kelly was behaving like her cousin Susan. He gently told me that Doug was bragging about sleeping with Kelly 3 times a week. I was furious. It's one thing to suspect, but hearing it confirmed hit hard. I realized I'd been a fool. I decided to confront Susan Peterson directly. Hearing she was at her parents' estate, I drove over. When I arrived, I asked Susan bluntly, "Is Doug sleeping with my wife?" She looked shocked and replied, "You don't mess around, Roger." "Well, it's all over town," I said. Susan broke down in tears and explained she had left Doug and was now back living at home, with divorce on the horizon. She revealed they were forced into marriage and resented each other from the start. Doug openly cheated, even keeping an apartment near his office for his affairs. In response, Susan began having her own affairs out of spite. Things came to a head when Doug admitted he was involved with Kelly and that it was only a matter of time before she moved in. That was Susan's breaking point, and she left. We talked more, but I was beyond sympathy. Susan vowed to make Doug pay, but I wanted my own revenge. I wished her well, hoping it would be the last time we spoke. When I got home, my parents were out, and Kelly had left a note saying she needed to talk urgently. Ignoring her calls, I grabbed a beer and sat on the deck. My parents returned later, and after a few more beers, I went to bed. The next morning, I woke to the smell of breakfast and had a quiet meal with my folks before heading to the store for the final handover. After lunch, Dad and I went fishing, and he agreed I should confront the situation directly. When we got back, Kelly's BMW was in the driveway. Inside, she was sitting with tissues, having talked to my mom. My parents quickly left, giving us space. Kelly broke down, explaining that Susan had called to say she was divorcing Doug, and mentioned I knew about Doug's so-called late meetings. Panicked, Kelly had driven straight to my parents' house to talk. Through tears, Kelly insisted she wasn't having an affair with Doug. She claimed the late meetings were legitimate, and that Susan had started the rumors to break us up. Kelly also said she would stop attending late meetings with Doug. Her story seemed rehearsed, and I didn't buy it. I knew Susan didn't love me, Doug hated me, and the Bates women had a reputation for cheating. I realized Kelly was now the enemy, but I needed evidence before confronting her. I pretended to forgive her, putting on a convincing act. We went out to dinner, and she left the next morning, happy and unaware of my suspicions. Once she was gone, I called Sandman to help with surveillance on Kelly. I also asked my dad to tell Kelly I was staying until Sunday, buying time to gather more information. After packing my car, I said goodbye and headed back to the city. Sandman still hadn't returned my call, but I didn't worry about it. I checked into a hotel far enough from anyone Kelly or I knew, then went to work to greet my boss and request another week off, which he approved. While there, I opened a new bank account in my name and transferred half of our joint savings, ensuring my future paychecks would go into it. Feeling more secure, I returned to the hotel and tried calling Sandman again, still no answer. I headed to the bar for a beer and chatted with the bartender until my dad called to check in. After a few beers, I decided to call it a day, paid my tab, and went back to my room to shower and change. Just as I was leaving for a late lunch, Sandman finally called back. He apologized for the delay, explaining he'd just been promoted to detective. We agreed to meet at a local bar. At the bar, which turned out to be a cop hangout, we found a booth and ordered beers. I told Sandman everything, the rumors about Kelly and Doug, the late meetings, and Kelly's changed behavior. Sandman listened and then jokingly asked if I wanted Doug kneecapped. We laughed but then got serious. We needed evidence of the affair, and Sandman promised to handle it, using his connections. The next morning, I woke up with a hangover but followed Sandman's advice to act normal. I canceled my leave and told Kelly I'd be home that night. She welcomed me warmly, and over dinner she suggested starting a family. I knew it was pointless given my condition, but I said nothing. As weeks passed, I grew anxious waiting for Sandman's update. Kelly questioned our joint account balance, and I made up a story about lending Dad money, which satisfied her. Finally, in early December, Sandman called with news, and we met again at the same bar. He handed me an envelope saying it was good news. The private investigator's report cleared Kelly. She had been faithful, just living her routine life. Doug, on the other hand, was a mess, involved with multiple women, gambling, and pills. Sandman revealed that Doug was about to be busted for cocaine, and his downfall would make headlines. It was the perfect Christmas gift. I bought a round for the bar, then headed home to my wife. Sandman promised to visit over the weekend. When I got home, Kelly was all over me, and we had intense, passionate sex. Afterwards, she surprised me by saying, "You're going to be a father." I was shocked, but Kelly mistook my reaction for excitement. She happily shared her pregnancy news, explaining she wanted to wait until after the first trimester to tell me. She then started talking about the nursery, baby shower, and maternity leave. But I zoned out. The realization that I was being deceived hit hard. As a logical person, I quickly concluded that the baby couldn't be mine because I was sterile. I knew Kelly had to go, but I needed to play it smart. I couldn't believe Kelly thought she could pass off the baby as mine, given our near non-existent sex life. I tossed and turned, watching her sleep peacefully, anger boiling inside me. Unable to stay in bed, I went downstairs to my study. I even considered using my weapon, but decided against it. I knew I needed a plan. I realized my life was built on lies. I concluded that the baby wasn't mine. Kelly was a cheater, Sandman had betrayed me, and Doug was just a pawn. Feeling surrounded by enemies, I knew I had to pretend everything was normal while planning my next move. My first step was to reach out to Doug Peterson. The next morning, I left early, made a call to Doug's office, and left an urgent message. By mid-morning, it was clear he wasn't going to call back. I didn't want to risk going to his office and being seen by Kelly or her colleagues, so I decided to follow him instead. I rented an SUV and waited outside his office. When Doug left, I discreetly followed him to an apartment building. Seizing the moment, I pulled up, grabbed him, and drove off. Doug was terrified, thinking I was going to eliminate him, but I assured him I just wanted to talk. We drove to a secluded spot by a lake where I handed him the report Sandman had compiled. As Doug read it, he muttered that it was all lies, blaming Susan. I told him the report was from Greg Sands, not Susan. Doug realized he was in deeper trouble than he thought. Doug turned even paler, convinced I was going to eliminate him. Instead, I surprised him by saying I didn't believe most of the report, except that he likely cheated on his wife. I then stunned him further by saying we needed to help each other. Doug, a weak figurehead controlled by his father, wasn't the playboy the report claimed, but he was still vulnerable. I told Doug that he needed to leave town immediately because Sandman was planning to frame him with pills and get him arrested. Doug was bewildered, asking why I was helping him and why Sandman was targeting him. I explained that I needed his father's connections to dig into Sandman's background. Doug called his father, arranged to leave the country, and handed me the phone. Reluctantly, Mr. Peterson Sr. agreed to provide a full report on Sandman within a few days. As for why Sandman was doing this, I couldn't give Doug a clear answer. I suspected it was Sandman's twisted way of revenge. I waited with Doug until his father's people arrived to take him away, knowing this would delay Sandman's plans and buy me time to figure things out. I returned to the city, dropped off the rental, and decided to lay low. Needing a break from everything, I accepted an assignment from work that sent me on a 2-week trip to regional offices. Kelly wasn't thrilled about my sudden departure, but I reminded her that I needed to keep my boss happy with the baby on the way, which quieted her. The 2 weeks passed quickly, but I had trouble reaching Mr. Peterson Sr. for the report. On my last day, a courier delivered a thick package, the report on Greg Sands. I spent half the night reading it, pausing several times for straight whiskey as the details unsettled me. The Greg Sands I knew at 18 had turned into a twisted individual by 28. The report revealed his violent childhood, including witnessing his mother's homicide. His stepmother and father tried to manage his rage by enrolling him in boxing, which led to his success as a champion. But the man he had become was far more dangerous than I had imagined. The report answered all my questions but provided no comfort. I realized I was just collateral damage in a long-standing power struggle. Worse, if Sandman discovered I knew the truth, he would likely eliminate me. There wasn't much of interest until Greg Sands joined the army. That's when everything became clear, and I realized I needed to distance myself. I knew about our basic training, but the real revelations came after Sandman completed Special Forces training. The key figure was General Edward Bates, who led Sandman's unit. They clashed constantly. Bates was ruthless, while Sandman valued righteousness and his men. Their biggest conflict? Sandman's relationship with Bates's daughter, Kelly. Initially, Sandman got involved with Kelly to spite Bates, but it quickly became serious. Kelly resembled Sandman's late mother, which deepened his attachment. Things fell apart when Sandman proposed, and Kelly refused, saying she needed her father's approval. Shortly after, Bates sent Sandman's unit on dangerous missions, culminating in a disastrous operation that left many dead or injured, including Sandman. Bates retired in disgrace, and Kelly ended things with Sandman, following her father's wishes despite her love for him. Afterward, Sandman plotted revenge. When he learned I was marrying Kelly, he saw a new opportunity. He left the military, became a cop in my city, and planned to ruin Kelly's reputation by seducing her, getting her pregnant, and causing a scandal. His ultimate goal was to destroy Bates by using Peterson Sr.'s influence after framing Doug Peterson. But I derailed his plans by helping Doug escape. I knew Sandman would come after me once he realized what happened. My first move was to get Kelly out of town, hoping it would distract Sandman. Then I had to decide whether to stay and face him or leave before things escalated. When I returned home, it was too quiet. Our dog was gone and Kelly's clothes were missing. In the kitchen, I found a note from Kelly saying she had a business meeting and that our dog was with my parents. It seemed like an excuse, and I suspected she was with Sandman. To confirm, I called the police station and learned Sandman was on a 2-week vacation. Realizing I might be jumping to conclusions, I decided to call Peterson Sr. Surprisingly, he answered, "What do you want, trailer trash? You got the report, didn't you?" Peterson sneered. "Yeah, thanks," I replied, though it was a week late. He asked, "Why are you wasting my time?" "I'm trying to find my wife, Kelly Easton," I said. He laughed and asked, "How's your marriage going?" Then he added, "She's at a meeting with Brett White, the temporary CEO." I thanked him, but before hanging up, he couldn't resist a jab. No doubt White's giving her the bedroom tour. I realized Kelly had actually told the truth, but I still worried, where's Sandman? I got my answer the next morning. I woke up determined to end the charade. "I'm divorcing Kelly and moving on. Let Sandman have the Bates clan. I'm done with this sick game." I knew I had loved Kelly, but her betrayal destroyed our future. Revenge was tempting, but my sanity mattered more. While I was deep in thought, Kelly called. I ignored it, not ready to hide my contempt. After a shower and coffee, I headed to work, where I made a lawyer appointment and cleared out our bank accounts. I wanted my assets liquid and on hand. At 10 a.m., my life took another turn. A courier delivered a package with familiar handwriting. Inside was a videotape and 2 notes. One read, "I know," written in what looked like blood. The second was a newspaper clipping. Peterson Corporation CEO found dead. Doug Peterson had been found dead on a beach, with police treating it as foul play. I didn't need to watch the tape. I knew it contained Doug's confession. My military instincts kicked in. I left the office, ignoring my secretary, and drove out of the city. I realized 3 things. Doug had confessed to Sandman. Sandman could find me anywhere, and he was going to eliminate me for ruining his plans. I drove to my old sergeant, Brian Moses, who had connections and could help me disappear. When I arrived, Brian was relaxing on the beach. I hated dragging him into this, but had no choice. "Lieutenant, what brings you here?" Brian asked. "I need your help, Brian. I need to disappear. No questions asked," I said. Understanding the seriousness, Brian made a call and took me downstairs for a quick photo session to create a new identity. We avoided the heavy topic and ate while waiting. An hour later, a guy arrived to handle the new identity. Brian put me up for the night, and as I tried to relax, my thoughts drifted to Kelly. Concerned for her safety, I made a call. She answered almost immediately. "Kelly, listen carefully. Get your things and leave the hotel immediately. Don't go home to your parents or mine," I urged. Kelly laughed. "Roger, what are you talking about? Are you drunk?" "No, Kelly, stay away from Sandman and run for your life," I warned. "Why would I do that?" she asked, confused. "Kelly, I know everything, including that the baby is Sandman's. He's not who you think he is. You've been warned," I said firmly. Before she could respond, I hung up and smashed my phone to prevent any tracking. I worried for my parents, but believed Sandman was focused on me, Kelly, and the general. After a few drinks with Brian, I went to bed. The next morning, I paid $10,000 for a new identity, now Justin Green, with all the necessary documents. I left the ID materials with Brian, who promised to arrange a new vehicle for me. But first, I needed Roger Easton to die. Years ago, a soldier under my command told me about his small hometown hell. It had a corrupt police force, but few major crimes, perfect for my plan. That night, I visited a nearby town's morgue, easily bribing the night attendant to let me see the John Doe bodies. I found one that matched my size and shape. Another bribe ensured the attendant would forget me. He mentioned he'd be on duty Saturday night, which fit my plan perfectly. I arrived in hell and booked a motel for 4 nights, making sure the staff remembered my name. The next morning, I made myself known around town, meeting locals, including the mayor, and telling them I'd be staying for a few days. After breakfast, I found the ideal spot for my staged end of life, a notorious cliff just outside hell where many had driven off to their end of lives. Everything was falling into place. Next, I needed transport for Saturday night. After some searching, I found a dirt bike for sale on a small farm, bought it, and loaded it into my truck. Later, I stopped at the diner for a late lunch and met Sheriff Baxter. He seemed lazy and incompetent, confirming my decision to avoid his recommended bar. That night, I visited a busy but seedy local bar. I had some drinks, made jokes with the locals, and bought rounds for everyone, which quickly made me popular. This place would work perfectly for Saturday night. Afterward, I drove to the cliff outside town, hid my dirt bike, helmet, and clothes, and then returned to the motel to sleep. I woke up early Saturday, confident everything was set. After breakfast at the diner, where I chatted with the locals and left a generous tip, I returned to the motel to eliminate time by watching TV and reviewing my plan. Lunch at a local restaurant followed, with more small talk and another big tip. By early evening, it was time to head to the morgue. I parked behind the morgue, hoping the same attendant was on duty. As expected, he left soon after, likely to score pills or booze. I quickly picked the lock, retrieved the John Doe body, and confirmed there were no new security measures. With the body loaded in my truck, I drove to the cliff, hit it, and went back into town. At the motel, I showered, changed clothes, and left everything behind before heading to the bar. The place was packed, just as I hoped. The locals welcomed me, remembering the generous out-of-towner. I bought drinks, acted increasingly drunk, and started buying shots for everyone. I barely drank, discreetly leaving bottles behind, but everyone thought I was having a wild night. At one point, the bartender, concerned, suggested I give him my truck keys. Thinking quickly, I threw $500 on the bar, yelled, "Drinks for everyone!" and slipped out as the crowd surged to the bar. I staggered to my truck, keeping up the act, and drove off, weaving until I was out of sight. I reached the cliff, parked, and retrieved the body from the bushes. Stripping off my clothes, I dressed the body in them, then soaked the truck and the body in whiskey. I opened the fuel tank, placed a fuel-soaked rag in it, and started the engine. As the truck rolled toward the edge, I lit the rag and watched it plunge down the cliff and explode. I hopped on my dirt bike and rode off, heading for my freedom. Early the next morning, I arrived at Brian Moses' beach house. Brian had bought me a knock-up truck and made an offer. I could hide out in a remote cabin his late father owned near a town called Last Chance. I agreed, feeling it was a fitting place to lay low. Before I left, Brian gave me a phone and warned, "Only use this to receive messages from me. If you get an emergency text, leave immediately." After grabbing my new ID and clothes, I hugged Brian and drove to the cabin. The directions were easy to follow, and I arrived by lunchtime. The cabin was isolated and perfect for hiding out. I settled in, determined to grow a beard and change my appearance before venturing into town. Brian had stocked enough supplies to last a month. My only thought now was, I hope everyone believes I'm dead. I began working out daily, using the trails for long-distance running to get back in shape. A week later, I received a text from Brian. "Roger Easton is dead. Funeral next week. We'll watch over your family." I felt guilty about the pain I was causing my family, but it was necessary for their safety. I didn't hear from Brian for the rest of the month. 3 weeks into my new life as Justin Green, I was satisfied with my progress. I'd lost weight and grown a decent beard, though I wanted another week before venturing into town. Finally, I decided to watch the video Sandman had sent. It was brutal. Doug Peterson had been tortured and confessed everything, including my involvement. The butcher, dressed in black and masked, was clearly Sandman. At the end of the video, Sandman threatened, "I'm coming to eliminate you, Roger, and destroy everything you hold dear." Watching the video enraged me. Sandman was no longer just a threat. He was a sick, deluded butcher who enjoyed his work. His ability to switch his rage on and off terrified me. I realized he wouldn't stop until he finished off his enemies, and my family could be next. I couldn't live in fear forever. Motivated by the video, I intensified my training, pushing myself to my limits. By week 5, I was ready to venture into town. I kept a low profile, bought supplies, and picked up a laptop with internet access. I also bought a 7mm semi-auto rifle, a 9mm SIG P228, and plenty of ammunition. At a pawn shop, I found an old boxing bag and gloves. On my way back to the cabin, I saw a sign for puppies. I stopped and bought a border collie puppy, Jess, to keep me company and serve as an early warning system. Back at the cabin, I settled in, set up my purchases, and fed Jess. Later, I searched online for news about Roger Easton. I found a local newspaper article titled, "Drunken Man Burns to End of Life Near Hell." It described how Roger Easton, a visitor well known to locals, had gotten drunk, driven off a cliff, and died in a fiery crash. Sheriff Baxter confirmed no suspicious circumstances. The only other mentions were about my funeral arrangements, indicating the plan had worked, at least temporarily. For the next 6 months, I lived in isolation, with Jess as my only companion. I ventured into town once a month, where people called me Grizzly Adams due to my beard and long hair. I trained hard, regained my Army fitness, and sharpened my shooting skills. Brian occasionally texted me, and I rarely used the internet. One July day, I checked my hometown's local paper and found troubling news. The Easton hardware store had burned down under suspicious circumstances 5 months earlier. Though the new owner had kept the name, I knew Sandman was behind it. It confirmed that he hadn't forgotten about the Easton family. What disturbed me most was a story about the tragic end of lives of a wealthy family. The article likened it to the Kennedy curse, starting with Susan Bates's end of life. She fell down the stairs in a drunken stupor and broke her neck. On the day of her funeral, her parents, along with General Bates and his wife, died in a car crash on the way to the service. This left Kelly Bates Easton as the sole heiress of the Bates fortune. The article mentioned Kelly was deeply traumatized, having recently lost her husband to self-destruction. I found that odd since my end of life had only been reported as an accident. This new detail made me suspect Kelly was more involved in these events than I had initially thought. 2 other stories caught my eye. One was a wedding announcement. Kelly Bates Easton had married Greg Sands a month ago. The other was about Douglas Peterson Sr. suffering a heart attack and being airlifted to a city hospital. I wasn't sure if Sandman was involved, but I knew I had to stop hiding and take control. My first stop would be the hospital to see Peterson Sr., followed by a visit to Sandman. I packed quickly, grabbed my SIG P228 and my dog Jess, and hit the road. Jess, sensing my tension, was nervous on the drive. We arrived at Brian's beach house in the afternoon. He didn't recognize me at first, but Jess jumping all over him gave me away. "Lieutenant, nice look, Bigfoot," Brian laughed as we hugged. He invited me in for a beer, and after settling Jess with some water and snacks, I decided to tell Brian everything. I spent a couple of hours recounting the whole story, from my history with Sandman to Kelly's affair, her pregnancy, faking my end of life, and the recent end of lives of the Bates and Peterson families. I also showed him the reports and newspaper articles I had gathered, asking him to keep them safe in case anything happened to me. Brian was serious. "Lieutenant, Special Forces guys like Sandman aren't to be messed with. He's gone rogue." "I know, Brian, but I can't live in fear. I have to stop him," I replied. Brian offered to help, but I insisted he stay out of it, asking him instead to protect my family if things went wrong. After some convincing, he reluctantly agreed. Brian's biggest concern was whether I could actually eliminate Sandman. "If it's eliminate or be liquidated, I'll have to," I said, aware that I was up against a trained butcher with power and resources. I knew my chances were slim, but I had no choice. I had never considered liquidating anyone, but as the saying goes, evil triumphs when good men do nothing. I'd run long enough. It was time to face the music. Late at night, I headed back to the city where I had lived and worked for years. I arrived late, checked into a cheap hotel, and dropped off my gear. Then I texted Brian to let him know I was safe and planned to visit Peterson Sr. at the hospital. By the time I arrived, visiting hours were over, just as I wanted. My beard and long hair would help obscure my identity from many security cameras. I knew the hospital layout well, and had already confirmed Peterson Sr. was in room 319 on the 3rd floor. I avoided security, slipped into the restroom, and waited until the coast was clear. I made my way to room 319, where I found Peterson Sr. pale and hooked up to monitors. I must have dozed off for about 15 minutes, only to be awakened by a nurse checking on him. After she left, I stepped out of the restroom quietly. Peterson Sr. startled me by speaking first. "Come closer. Let me see the face of my butcher, Mr. Sands," he said shakily. I turned on a small light, and he seemed surprised. "So Sands farms out his work now? What a gutless fool." "Get on with it," he sneered. "I'm not here to eliminate you, old man," I said. Recognizing my voice, he asked, "Easton, is that you?" He began to weep, but they were tears of relief, not pain. This was not the reaction I expected. Despite our past, Peterson Sr. seemed genuinely glad I was alive. We talked until morning, and I left the hospital with two valuable things: a key to a safety deposit box and crucial information. Back at the motel, I texted Brian and got some sleep. Waking up at 11 a.m., I showered, ate, and called the hospital. Peterson Sr. confirmed that I could access safe deposit box 112 under my new identity, Justin Green. Before heading to the bank, I stopped at a barbershop to shave my head and beard. I wasn't hiding anymore. Even with the change, you'd have to look twice to recognize me. I was leaner and more muscular. At the bank, I was treated like a VIP. After accessing the box, I took everything: a large envelope and a significant amount of money. I returned to the motel, grabbed some takeout, and sat down to think. My conversation with Peterson Sr. had been eye-opening. Since my end of life, things had escalated quickly for Greg Sands. With Doug and me out of the picture, the general had become Sandman's main target. After I called Kelly that night, she didn't run away. She ran straight into Sandman's arms. Rumor had it she was telling people that I had abandoned her when I died. Sandman and Kelly were thrilled to be together, though Sandman was frustrated he couldn't personally take me down. With me out of the way, only General Bates remained as a problem. Peterson Sr. assured me the report in the safety deposit box would explain everything. He was furious and grieving over his son's end of life, but even with all his money and power, he couldn't get to Sandman. He had started a reinvestigation into both Sandman and Kelly Bates. Kelly had quickly dropped the Easton name, and this time Peterson spared no expense. Initially, he planned to use me as a weapon against them, but then I died. Before his heart attack, Peterson Sr. had been planning to hire some shady characters to deal with Sandman. When I showed up, he decided to help me instead, believing my revenge-fueled determination could succeed where money couldn't. He called it bloodlust and had more confidence in me than I did. I took the key and promised to keep him informed. Sitting in front of the thick report, I started reading. Much of it was information I already knew, but it added details that made me realize how thoroughly I had been played. Peterson Sr. must have spent a fortune on it. Greg Sands and Kelly Bates were instantly attracted to each other years ago. The hatred between General Bates and Sandman was real, but contrary to earlier reports, Kelly hadn't refused to marry Sandman. Instead, they planned to elope, with Sandman leaving the army to become a cop. However, General Bates discovered the plan and had Sandman's unit deployed to the Middle East, hoping he'd be liquidated in action. When Kelly kept writing to Sandman, declaring her love, the general threatened to have him brought back in a body bag if she continued. In a rare act of selflessness, Kelly broke things off, fearing her father would make good on his threat. Heartbroken, Sandman hoped to reconnect with Kelly during R&R, but the general sent his unit into a deadly mission instead. Although Sandman survived, he was forever changed. After the general was forced to resign, Kelly never forgave him, and Sandman's rage resurfaced. Liquidating became his outlet, and his military training made him effective. As for me, I was just a pawn. Kelly, close to her cousin Susan, knew all about me through Sandman. She came to the festival with the intention of marrying me as a means to stay connected to Sandman. When the marriage lasted longer than she intended, she tried to push me away by denying closeness, hoping I'd leave. Her ultimate goal was for Sandman to return, become jealous, and reclaim her. Much of the report's information came from Susan Peterson, who, bitter over Doug's end of life, revealed everything Kelly had confided in her. Sandman returned to civilian life, seeking both Kelly and revenge on the general. When he found Kelly again, they resumed their relationship, and she became pregnant. Kelly then hinted at an affair with Doug Peterson to provoke me into either liquidating him or divorcing her, clearing the way for her and Sandman. When I approached Sandman for help, he saw an opportunity. He doctored the report on Kelly to keep me distracted, then planned to frame Doug for pill charges. Once that was done, Sandman intended to ally with Peterson Sr. by getting Doug off the charges and using him to destroy General Bates. The plan fell apart when Kelly told me she was pregnant because no one knew I was sterile. That confirmed her cheating, and I knew it had to be with Sandman since Doug's involvement was fake. I wanted quick revenge for both Sandman's lies and Kelly's betrayal. I realized Sandman was setting up Doug to push me into action, so I decided to protect Doug out of spite. At the time, I didn't realize how crucial Doug was to Kelly and Sandman's plan to eliminate me. When Doug vanished, Sandman was enraged and hunted him down. After torturing Doug, he discovered I had sabotaged his plan to get the general. In his fury, he sent me the video package, trying to provoke me into making a reckless move he could exploit. Complicating things, my call to warn Kelly inadvertently tipped off Sandman that I had left the city. She informed him, and he started searching for me. Only my quick thinking and Brian's help kept me and my family safe. When I faked my self-destruction, they were thrilled, and I became irrelevant, allowing Sandman to focus on the general. It seems Kelly and Sandman caught wind of people asking questions. They figured out Susan had talked and decided to eliminate her. Susan thought her money would protect her, but they saw an opportunity to remove her and the general without suspicion. They didn't care if Kelly's mother, aunt, and uncle died too. Susan went out for the evening, and when she returned, Sandman was waiting. He broke her neck, making it look like she had fallen down the stairs while drunk. Then they tampered with the general's car, ensuring it crashed on the way to Susan's funeral. Just like that, the Bates family was gone, and Kelly inherited everything: wealth and political connections. Sandman had taken out all his enemies except Peterson Sr. After a brief mourning period, Kelly and Sandman married. The only glitch was Kelly's mishap. Whether it was a natural loss or deliberate because they suspected the baby wasn't Sandman's, I don't know. Sandman likely planned to get rid of Peterson Sr. next, but the heart attack probably felt like a lucky break, as it could eliminate him off without their involvement. Reflecting on all this, I considered walking away. But then I thought about my mom, dad, and sister. If Sandman got bored, he might target the rest of the Easton family too. No, I decided. As my dad always said, when you've got a diseased dog, the most humane thing to do is put him down. I woke up the next morning wondering if it would be my last day. After a shower, I called Brian and updated him on my plan. I'm going to ambush Sandman at the Bates mansion. He and Kelly moved in right after her uncle and aunt died, and Sandman is on leave, so he should be there, I explained. I thanked Brian again for everything, and he promised to take care of my family, including Jess, if things went wrong. I spent the rest of the day resting and preparing. Once it was dark, I dressed in black, checked my weapon one last time, and left the motel. Driving through town, I reflected on my past with Sandman and how it had come to this. I parked far from the Bates house, grabbed my gear, and made my way to the mansion. Knowing the layout from my high school days with Susan, I reached the perimeter quickly. Using night vision equipment, I saw Kelly leaving in her BMW. I waited 5 minutes to ensure she didn't return before approaching the house. Peeking through a window, I saw Sandman in the dining room with a glass of wine. I quietly entered through the garage and crawled into the kitchen, staying low. Sandman was at the dining table with his back to me, engrossed in some papers. I prepared myself mentally, knowing I might have to shoot him in the back. As I raised my weapon, Sandman somehow sensed me and hit the floor. My first shot missed, and he fired back, hitting my shoulder. Pain shot through me as I realized he was armed, even on leave. I knew I was outmatched and made a run for the garage door, firing for cover. Suddenly the lights went out and I tripped. 4 shots hit the door where I had just been. Fear gripped me. Sandman was coming for me and I was losing blood. I decided to go out fighting. I fired blindly toward where I thought he might be, but I heard nothing. Then the driveway lights came on, revealing Sandman on the floor, dazed from a graze to the head. A knife lay between us, and as I reached for it, Sandman regained consciousness. "Never bring a knife to a weapon fight, Roger," he taunted. But before he could act, blood splattered as Sandman fell dead. Brian had arrived just in time. He dragged me outside, stopped my bleeding, and went back into the house for a few minutes before driving us away at high speed. When I woke up, I was at Brian's house, sore but alive, thanks to a retired doctor friend of his. I had been unconscious for days, but Sandman was dead. I returned to the cabin with Jess to recover and followed the news about Greg Sands' end of life. The police concluded that 2 armed intruders had ambushed him, and there were no leads. Brian had erased the evidence during those crucial 5 minutes, and Sandman was given a hero's funeral. But dead was dead. I planned to confront Kelly, but she knocked me to it. True to her selfish nature, she took her own life with Sandman's weapon, leaving a note saying she couldn't live without him. It felt hollow that I didn't get to end it on my terms, but she always stayed one step ahead. Now, I'm driving to Brian's beach house with Jess beside me for a family reunion. Roger Easton remains dead, but Jess doesn't care as long as Justin Green survives. As I drive, I reflect on love, friendship, and betrayal. The past is the past. It doesn't define the future. I will survive.